Hey there, my name is Charlotte Kibe and you're watching When Things Change. And as usual, this is a space where we get to hang out and have conversations on conscious parenting. And our topic of the day is a rather big one. Today we are handling sex and sexuality. And I have one of my favorite people who's here to help us unpack it and, find out together how we're supposed to deal with these talks when we're trying to educate and inform and train up our kids. My guest is Curtis Reed. He's an educator, a pastor, a Kenyan. I think it's really important that I put that out. And yeah, I'm excited for you guys to meet him. Hi, Pussy.
Hello, Charlotte.
How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me here.
Thank you for coming through.
It's my honor.
You're one person I really wanted on here.
Thank you. I'm humbled.
And you know why. You know that when it comes to sex and sexuality, I've told you this many times, I've tackled it from a scholarly perspective. I've heard what people have to say in the media. I've had a lot about it, or quite a bit about it, in church and other platforms. Yes. And as I keep saying, no one has given me as much perspective on it as you have. Wow. And that's why I really wanted to have this conversation with you.
Well, I'm excited about it.
Karibu sana.
God will help us.
He must. Absolutely. He must. He's got to come through. Otherwise, what are we doing here? So, a little bit about yourself, Pussy.
Okay. Mm-hmm. I'm African American by birth and raised in Chicago. Mm-hmm. But I've been here in Kenya probably almost 20 years now. Mm-hmm. My wife is Kenyan, whom you know very well, I do. Together with our 3 children. Mm-hmm. So they are African American in a slightly different way than I am. So I'm a pastor, a youth pastor. Mm-hmm. Currently, I pastor at a church called Harvesters Global here in Nairobi. Mm-hmm. So between 18 and 25, that's like my docket. Mm-hmm. I think you were around that age when we first met. Yes. I also am a former lecturer at Daystar. Mm-hmm. Taught philosophy, taught hip-hop and the Bible. Mm-hmm. So I've got my hands in a few different plates. Right. Yeah. Right.
And why Kenya? I know we've spoken about this, but the good people might want to know why Kenya? Why not any other African country?
That's a great question, and this is another passion of mine. Mm-hmm. While I was in the States, I was doing college student work, primarily with African and African American students. And I felt like I needed more training in that area, and I wasn't convinced that seminaries or Bible schools in the States could help me reach our people. Mm-hmm. So I had a contact. Our people are black folks and African people, people of African descent, whether they're on the continent or in the diaspora in other parts of the world. Mm-hmm. And you lived in Australia, so I think you know something about that diaspora a bit. But so I was looking for schools here in Africa, thinking they could help me contextualize the gospel in a way that made sense to us. Mm-hmm. So I found a seminary, and that's how I initially came to Kenya.
Right. So when you first came, were you coming to stay? Were you coming to marry and settle and build here like you have?
I was not. I was coming to learn. So it was a 2-year master's degree course, African church history. But of course, along the way, I did meet the woman who became my wife several years later. Made some amazing people, some of which are in this room in the background. Right. And so it was from that initial experience that somehow I knew that God was calling me here long term. Right. And I'm excited about that.
Are you happy here?
I very much am happy here. Great. Don't get me wrong, people always ask me, why are you here? Why are you not in the States? Every place has its challenges. I know Kenya has its challenges. America definitely has its challenges. But all things considered, I prefer being here in Kenya. And you really want to be in the middle of God's will. Right. And for me, this is God's will for me.
Oh, great. Fantastic. Fantastic. That's the ultimate, isn't it? The human experience. If you're not within the will of God for your life, you're misplaced wherever you are. Right? Right. I'm glad you found your place, your purpose, and you're here to talk with me about sex and sexuality and eventually how that translates to how we handle the topic with kids. I want to know, what was your introduction to the topic, you as a person? When did you first learn about your sexuality, that you are a sexual being, as we all are?
Yeah. Okay, you want to go there. Painful. My initial memories about sex and sexuality are quite painful. Essentially, I learned about sex in the streets, and I was told it was dirty, it was nasty. I mean, it was something that you had to do because it was pleasurable, but at the same time, it wasn't associated with anything loving, anything lovely. And so it was kind of like a necessary evil. Unfortunately, that was kind of reinforced in the church, I'm sorry to say. Once I became a Christian at 18, pretty much got the same kind of message. Don't do it. But they never said anything life-affirming about sex or about sexuality. So my first conversation with my parents, my mom and dad divorced when I was 7. I was a really insecure, sensitive child and a very poor student because of discipline issues. My father ended up coming. He came to the house for about 15 minutes. He asked me if I was having sex. I think I was 14 at the time. And I told him yes, because I thought that's what boys are supposed to be doing at my age. I lied to him. So he said, okay, I'll be right back. So he went downstairs from our apartment, pulled out a big box of condoms. I'm looking from the window to see what he's going to do. He pulled out some condoms, brought it upstairs, and said, here, since you're having sex, at least use these. And that was it. That was the bird of the bees sex talk.
So at 14, that's what you get from your father, who you have lied to that you're active, and he gives you condoms and he leaves it at that. And you having picked it up from the streets, and you're talking about having learned it in a negative way, and then coming to realize that it's quite a pleasurable thing because it is what it is, and that creating that kind of conflict, on the one hand, it's enjoyable. On the other hand, it's been painted as this one dirty, necessary evil. How does that come together in your mind at such a young age?
It didn't. That's the whole thing. It was, I felt schizophrenic. Again, that kind of necessary evil kind of thing. I ended up, and this was the real, I was really silly, really mischievous. So I would write these pornographic, erotic short stories. I would write one a week. I'm a virgin at this time, of course.
And where are the ideas coming from?
The streets. Just flat out, the streets. That was my only framework, my only reference point. And we would make copies of these short stories, and I would sell them to students in the high school.
You're quite the entrepreneur.
Imagine.
Peddling pornographic material at 14.
Yeah, and now it's public for everyone to...
And you had customers, you had willing buyers.
People loved that stuff.
So you made yourself an authority on the topic.
Basically, imagine.
That's
it was crazy, craziness.
Right. And the reason why we're having this podcast and these conversations is because I've written a children's book. You know about it. You've known about it from its infancy.
I know about it.
It's right here. And one of the really crucial topics is this particular one. It came up when I was doing research for for another project, and every time we would get to sex and sexuality, parents would tighten up a bit. Everybody recognizing the importance of it, why we need to have it, and more parents than not telling me that they didn't know how to navigate, they didn't know how to go about it. So here you are talking about having learned about it from the streets. I want you to let our parents know, our audience know, the dangers of allowing your kids to learn about this ever so pertinent topic from anybody other than yourself.
Thank you. I think the thing we want to avoid at all costs is we don't want children to grow up schizophrenic, and I'm not using that in a clinical way. I just mean where sexuality is divorced from the rest of life, divorced from one's spirituality, divorced from one's social interactions, and so forth. You don't want a shame-based sexuality, which is what I developed growing. And I'm not the only one. The conversations sometimes my wife and I, we counsel married couples, and you'll be shocked at what married people who are doing things, from a biblical standpoint, the right way, but still have these shame-based views of their bodies, sex, sexuality in general.
And that's a lot of us, largely because of decisions we've made or things that have been done to us even before we came to a consenting age. Most people have shame as the basis of their sexuality, and so how is a person who's tackling this whole topic from a perspective of shame supposed to inform or educate or instruct their kids?
That's a great question. I don't know if I have all the answers for that. All I know is, based on my own sexual dysfunction growing up and the pain associated with it, it forced me to do research, to learn about sex. And unfortunately, I couldn't do that in the church. There was no theology of sex. I think we're still trying to develop that here in Kenya. I'm not sure we've done a good job with that, speaking as a pastor. So I had to do study in science. I had to do, studies in spiritual context. The Catholic Church is actually much better than the evangelical church when it comes to matters of sexuality. And so there is material, and of course, as we keep going, I'm sure there'll be more and more material for us to engage with. But it's a tough sell, and it's a tough journey.
It sure is. I've grown up in church myself, and I know how we handled or mishandled that topic. First and most importantly, not even ever addressing it. And every time it's brought up, there's a bit of negativity, a bit of something shrouding it, a bit of secrecy, and that doesn't do us justice. You find yourself grown in the streets trying to figure out, hey, this is my baby, this is how I feel about certain things, and still unaware how to handle yourself, And
here's the thing, Charlotte, that doesn't change once you put a ring on it. So you have all these views, these shame-based, dirty, nasty views about sex, and then all of a sudden someone's supposed to put a ring on your finger, and all of those views automatically change.
Ebb away magically, And the thing is, you have a whole lot of grown-ups, married, having gotten into that marriage, thinking that it would cure or remedy all these issues they have surrounding sex. And what happens when you end up on the other end of that spectrum, like from single to married, and you still have all these misconceptions? What happens?
I remember one conversation we were having with a married couple. They were struggling with some things. I asked, particularly the woman, where is God when you make love to your husband. She said he is turning away his head in disgust.
And is he?
Of course not.
What is he?
I hope not. I hope he's saying, go Curtis, go Curtis. You know what I'm saying? I mean, sex is supposed to be something celebrated. He created it.
He did.
So as far as I know, the things that God has created are good and very good, in fact.
And eventually, all these conversations that we are having here are supposed to lead to how do we best train up our children so that they are well adjusted, well equipped to deal with life and themselves and others in a way that's uplifting. So here we are as adults. And the reason why it ought to start with us, and this is something you said to me once over the phone when I told you about my book and the kind of work I was doing, we need to deal with it ourselves before we can attempt to guide our children in any way. Why do you think that's the case? What happens when you don't settle it within yourself first?
I think much of what we teach children in regard to sex is more caught than it is taught. We can teach things in an abstract kind of way, giving children information. But I think what they're paying attention to, even more than what we're saying, is how we embody our own sexuality, our own interactions with our spouses or our boyfriends or our lovers or people of the opposite sex. That's, I think, what they're paying attention to more than these isolated individual conversations that usually don't last more than a few minutes.
Right. And one of the recommendations that I've made in the book is that this conversation should be ongoing.
That's right.
For a lot of people, the challenge is how to start. And there's all this awkwardness and all this fear that surrounds it. And do you talk about sex and sexuality with your kids?
I do, but I have to admit it's not an easy conversation. And maybe that's because of unresolved stuff I haven't dealt with. I'm not sure. I do know this, that in most cultures, it's hard to talk about sex. Sex is taboo. Part of that is probably because sex is so sacred.
Right.
Most sacred things aren't talked about openly often. The problem, however, is the society we live in is sex saturated.
It really is.
So everyone is talking about sex. And so if everyone is talking about sex and we are silent about sex as parents or as the church, then essentially what we're doing, we're setting our kids up for failure.
What happens when your kids learn about it like you did from the streets?
Yeah, they I'm assuming, of course, every child is different, different personalities, and they assimilate information in different ways. But I'm assuming that someone's going to grow up with a shame-based idea of sexuality. Their sexuality is going to be disconnected from other parts of their lives. So they won't know how they feel. They won't know what turns them on. They won't know how to have healthy boundaries and relationships with people of the opposite sex. They won't know what's appropriate, what's inappropriate, what's happening to their bodies as they evolve and change and grow into adolescence and then into adulthood. You know, they're in the dark about all of those different things, so they end up groping for whatever they can find. And unfortunately, there are enough pedophiles, people whose lusts have gone unchecked, who are very eager to take advantage of people who don't know who they are, whether that's ethnicity or sexuality or gender.
Right. So to not inform your children, to not be intentional about the sex conversation in your household is to leave your children vulnerable and exposed for whoever is out there with whatever kind of information. And that's something I really want to emphasize to parents. And the other thing would be faith and sexuality, because a bit of this shame, or a lot of it, comes from a need to be pure, a need to be holy, because there is this holy God that we want to align ourselves with, and then there is this filthy concept of sex that we've picked up along the way. So that becomes a clash in our minds. How do we remedy that? And I know you may not have the full answer, but how do we even start? And where are you on your personal journey in regards to that?
Yeah. Oh, you want to take it personal?
I do.
Okay. As long as I get to ask you some personal. Good.
You're welcome. Go
Okay.
for it.
All right. Again, I think, and I hate to say this as a pastor, but I think the church is part of the problem. We're going to have to learn to talk about sex in life-affirming, holistic ways. We have to begin to talk about the relationship, like you say, between faith and sex, spirituality and sex, sex and politics, really sex and everything. One of the things I normally say is life has everything and at the same time nothing to do with sex.
Right.
Life has everything and nothing to do with sex. Sex is the great divine metaphor. It is the thing that really gives flavor, gives context, gives power to our lives.
Right.
That's what it is. That's what it is in the scripture. That's what it is. Here's the interesting thing. Commercials, advertisements, business, marketing, they understand very well the power of sex.
They do. That's why they use it to sell everything,
Exactly.
from cigarettes to cars.
Exactly. And they understand that sex is a model for other things. So that's why the lady on the car, on the bonnet of the car, I mean, we're not stupid. We know the lady doesn't come with the car. But so what they're doing is pimping sex.
Right.
So that it points to something that is commodified that we buy, and then people laugh at us all the way to the bank.
Right. I was watching something really recently. It was a talk that detransitioning young lady was giving. She's American. I should have sent that to you before we had this conversation. And she's trying to admonish parents and let her know, speaking from a place of sexual confusion, because those are the words she uses about herself and her situation. She talks about the commodification of sex and sexuality, and how to some people, just as you're saying, your kids have got a dollar sign on them. People are trying to push ideology, to push products on them with the intention of making money out of them. So someone will mislead your children. It's nothing to them. Someone will, they'll lead them into a ditch. If it translates to $1, and that's something that parents need to guard against. And how do you guys have the conversation on sex in your house?
Well, I think it may have started off me asking, or my wife, or both of us, asking our children, what is sex? Have you heard about it? What are your thoughts? What kind of framework do you have right now about sex?
So you initiated it? You and Nash initiated the conversation?
We initiated the conversation.
And how old were they?
I think they were about 4. Yeah.
Each one, like when your child gets to about 4 years
At about 4 years old is when we start to initiate the conversation.
Right.
We become more proactive about talking about these things. And as you mentioned, I was taught, you're supposed to have a sexuality talk, like one. But we revisit this as often as we think is necessary. And we also leave the door open so that they can talk to us if they have any questions, any concerns. sometimes we just ask our children, has anyone touched you inappropriately? As opposed to waiting on them to tell us if it's happened, we'll just initiate it. And of course, we talk about what it means to touch inappropriate and what what your private parts are, and the fact that no one should have access to that except you or the doctor or us as parents when you're showering or something like that.
Right. And the beauty of you initiating this conversation as a parent is that you open the door for your kids to come to you when they have questions, when someone makes them feel uncomfortable. And I'm glad you brought it up, and I'm glad that you and Nash have the wherewithal to have gone about it and introduced it that way. And to the people who are watching us, this is part one of a two-part conversation, and you're definitely going to want to come back to check out the rest of this chat between me and Curtis on sex and sexuality and our children.